Thank you for joining today's webinar entitled A Primer on Stress Testing Your Pension Plan. My name is Hank Kim, and I'm the Executive Director for the National Conference on Public Employee Retirement Systems. Today's program is part of our Center for Online Learning, which provides remote continuing education to public pension trustees, staff, and other fiduciaries and stakeholders. In today's webinar, we will define what stress testing is, why it is critical for your pension plan, and how to conduct stress tests. We will explain the difference between stress testing and the traditional annual actuarial valuations. Finally, we will share real-life examples of how stress testing helped MainePERS cost-sharing plans for local governments become sustainable. Our presenters today are Jean Kowalski, founder and CEO of Cheiron, and Sandy Matheson, MainePERS Executive Director. We encourage audience participation. Please submit your questions by using the GoToMeetings portal. However, to ensure that we can cover all our topics, we will hold your questions till the last part of the program. So without further commentary, Jean, Sandy, the program is yours.
Well, thanks, Hank. And thanks very much for asking us to share our experience with stress testing. Stress testing is a practice that Cheiron has done for MainePERS for years now, and one that we have always valued. However, we recently found a very specific, very successful use for stress testing that we want to share with you today. We're going to talk about stress testing in general and why we think it is a good idea. We'll talk about how it works. We'll also talk about whether or not it is required or a recommended best practice. And finally, we'll share our real-life example about how we used it at MainePERS for one of our plans and the innovative changes we successfully made as a result of that. So, what is stress testing? I think there's a number of definitions that you can find or use or even create, or ways you can describe what stress testing is. But I like to think of it as a way to get a sense of the risks you could face or the risk you may actually face and what you should do to prepare for those risks. Equally important, however, is what stress testing is and is not. I think you get out of stress testing what you put into it. It's important not to be afraid of the risks you face, but to gain a deeper understanding of how those risks can impact your plan. Therefore, stress testing is an opportunity to assess the impacts of that risk. Understanding your plan risks allows you to do informed scenario testing and prepare for the outcomes of those tests. One extremely important benefit of understanding and preparing for the outcomes of your stress testing that you find is that you can communicate effectively with your stakeholders, members, employers, government sponsors, etc., to partner with them in what you want to do. And we found that invaluable in the recent changes that we made in one of our MainePERS plans. So stress testing is also not an answer. It does provide valuable information, however, and can be one of your best tools for making informed decisions in the best interest of your members. And finally, stress testing is not a weapon. One type of stress testing MainePERS performs periodically is very broad-based testing of all possible market outcomes, and some are good and some are bad. Some are very good and some are very bad. Most are within a more normal range. However, what we don't do is pick and choose which outcomes we want in order to justify what we want to do. We evaluate the results of the stress testing to help us determine what we should do. For me, one of the best ways to understand how stress testing works is to look at a hurricane map. You can see it on your screen. You have to balance being prepared for the most likely outcome of a hurricane as well as the worst. But if you only choose one outcome to prepare for and ignore the others, you're most likely not going to be well prepared for that hurricane. And I think the same thing goes for stress testing in your pension plan. You just can't choose one. You need to be well prepared for a range of outcomes. So now Jean's going to describe exactly how stress testing works and show some examples. And then we'll explain how more targeted stress testing created a big benefit for one of our plans.
Thank you, Sandy. Let me start with discussing who uses stress testing. There are articles or entities that are suggesting that stress testing is something new, but it's not. The insurance industry has been doing stress testing since the 1980s. Back then, there was a large, well-known insurance company that nearly toppled. And after the dust settled, the actuaries and the regulators took a look at how could this have happened. We have been doing forecasting. They realized they were forecasting best estimates. And we're not looking at the fact that best estimates may not, in fact, do not always happen. And so the insurance industry is now nearly 40 years of performing stress testing. The banking industry, after the credit crisis a decade ago, they've established stress tests now for banks. And even Social Security provides projections, optimistic, pessimistic, and best estimate. So I've always felt that a pension fund is no different than these entities. It's a large institution with money's going in and money's going out. And for years I've been wondering why pension plans don't routinely do stress testing. Think about technology and its impact on televisions. And think about technology and its impact on the medical profession. Think about the impact of technology on telephones. If you were to pick up an actuarial valuation report from 1960, it would look like this. A lot of numbers showing this year to last year. If you were to pick up last year's valuation report or this year's valuation report, it would look like this. And that's been my complaint, that we ought to be using technology to enhance the communication of risk and reward in our pension plans. The traditional approach is focused on this year's results versus last year's results. And we feel that that's like driving your car in the through a rear view mirror. It's informative to know what happened between this year and last year, but what's more important is where are you heading? So without projections, I think Sandy hit on some of these points, you really have no idea if the funding of your plan will work. And we can guarantee that any baseline projection you get will never be right, because you're never going to earn the same rate of return each and every year. Actual assumptions, there'll be gains and losses, and the uncertainty increases over time. Stress testing is particularly important today because most pension plans are mature, having maybe more retirees and inactives than actives. And that leads to negative cash flow, more money going out the door than coming in the door. And we have found that the greater the negative cash flow in a plan, the more vulnerable a plan is to future investment volatility. And repeating myself, forward-looking potential outcomes are far more important to focus on in making decisions than what's already happened. So now I'll talk about how stress testing works. We do start with a projection of expected results, which are called the best estimate assumptions. Then we test what happens if you are wrong, alternative scenarios, and finally decide which results you can't live with, and that helps you decide your risk tolerances. So the slide I have up there now is a baseline projection. It's not a stress test. That's the first step. And we're looking at a State contribution is a percentage of payroll with investment returns matching a 7% assumption. This is not MainePERS, just a generic pension fund. So that's not a stress test. It is your baseline projection. Now, a simple stress test for this pension fund is looking at returns over a 15-year period between 1930 and 1944, showing how the results that we just had on the base test will differ greatly. And that's a simple stress test, looking at historical periods. A more robust stress test is what's called a stochastic or Monte Carlo simulation, where we do thousands of runs, and we come up with that line in the middle there, which is your expected, and then bands around that, the 20 percentile, 70th, and 95th percentile results. I know investment consultants commonly use this technique on the investment side. So this is showing you how a stochastic test works. That line there is the expected, and then you start seeing spaghetti curves. And once you've done the thousands of runs, you get your bands and probabilities. So how not to do stress testing is on this next slide, and it's talking about the taxpayer picking up the bailout of the banks back in the 2000s. Is it a requirement? No, and I'll talk more about that in a subsequent slide. But we believe it's not only very good, but critical practice for all pension plans. It ought to be routinely part of the valuation. It should not have to be a special study. Technology has enabled actuaries to perform stress testing without that much extra work at all in doing a valuation. But with respect to whether it's a requirement, there have been publications and studies that have recently come out. On the upper right there, the report of the Blue Ribbon Panel on Public Pension Plan Funding, Society of Actuaries. There's a recommendation that forms of stress testing be performed, but no requirement. Most of you are familiar with the Pew Charitable Trusts. They have recently been conducting stress testing for a large number of states, and they perform it, I think, almost universally for the state legislatures. The Actuarial Standards Board, taking the report of the Blue Ribbon Panel, has come out with new actuarial standards of practice, ASOP 51, beginning with valuations that commence November 1st, 2018, as of November 1st, 2018 beyond. Additional risk measures will be required in valuation reports. But we have a frustration because still no requirements to do a projection, no requirements to do stress testing, and that's even the case if you suspect your plan might be going insolvent. So we'll continue to criticize our own profession on that score. And while this is not a public sector issue, there's a crisis out there in the multi-employer field. And there was a joint select committee on pensions that had a deadline from last week. And they were coming up with proposals that included some stress testing requirements and putting the blame on the professionals that serve these funds. So let's talk about the types of actuarial analysis that most systems do. Everyone does an annual actuarial evaluation, but like the earlier slide showed, that compared this year's results to the prior year. Periodically, asset liabilities studies are done, but from my experience, I've seen 95% of the studies I've seen focus mostly on asset allocation. They claim to bring in the liability side, but I've never, on those 95%, really seen the liability side adequately brought in. Then there are experience studies. Again, that's a backward-looking analysis. It's necessary, but it's not a stress test. So stress testing, while it's been around for years, is not a common practice. We hope it becomes a required practice. And what we'd like to do now is show how stress testing was actually used to help MainePERS participating local districts. So at this point, Sandy, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Gene. So a little bit about how I discovered, I think, the extreme value of stress testing. We have a multiple employer cost sharing plan for our local governments. And this plan historically, up until I think 2008, was well over 100% funded. And the recession hit. And so the recession, like everybody else, the recession hit the plan and we dropped into the 90s or something. But what we had done, while some plans maybe used or provided extra benefits with their excess funding, what this plan had done was to reduce the employer's contribution rate from 8% to 3%. So for 10 or 12 years, it was quite a pretty long period of time, the employers had gotten used to paying 3% instead of 8%. And so when the recession hit, we found ourselves in the predicament that we couldn't increase the rates all of a sudden back to the full 8%, and we needed to do a laddered approach and start increasing them up 1% per year, while the employers who were already suffering from the economy, and Maine is not Maine's a smaller state without a robust economy that some states have. So while the employers got used to that going up, they weren't necessarily paying their full actuarial contribution, normal cost, I should say, but they were paying it their full contribution based on the formula that we used. So the recovery was slowed down for the plan, and our funding eventually fell to 86% funded. So that was okay. We were on the way up, starting to pay, a little bit excess of the required contribution. And we had 2 flat years, and everybody probably remembers 2015 and 2016 as years where, at least in our case, I think we earned an average of 1.5%, and that wasn't untypical. Some people earned 3%, but it was substantially below what our earnings assumption was at that point in time of 6.875%. So in the spring of 2016, a lot of the economic predictions were that the markets were going to stay where they were and gradually go back up from this near break-even and slowly climb back up to where we could expect maybe 8% returns. And we were also in this near zero interest rate environment, so anything we did earn, pretty much, or the majority of what we earned had to be equity-based, so you had that volatility also. So we decided that we needed to test what would happen if those economic projections came through. And I was panicked, right? I mean, I'm going, oh no, what if we continue to earn 3% below our earnings assumption for the next 4 years before we go back up to averaging what our earnings assumption was? So we tested that, and here were the results, which is what really, I guess, lit a fire under me would be an understatement. But our contribution rates at the time for employees were fixed, so they would stay, but our employer contribution rates would more than double. And if that scenario came true, and while you can't predict those things, and certainly it's not how life actually turned out, but we had to consider it a real possibility. So we tested that, and I kind of went into a panic because if our employer contribution rates doubled, we knew we'd have some very negative outcomes. Employers in Maine couldn't afford those kind of rates. It's a voluntary plan. They could drop out if they wanted. And given the right circumstances, we could end up with a plan that either never paid a COLA again or any number of negative circumstances. So we knew we needed to do something. And what was important about this stress testing was we just realized exactly how vulnerable, this was targeted stress testing, but we realized how vulnerable our plan was, even though it was well funded. At the time, I think it was 89% funded. So even though it was well funded, we realized how vulnerable we were to a market scenario that you might not even think sounds so bad, earning 4% a year for 3 years. I mean, because you tend to think of bad ones as losing 20% one year or, whatever. So we realized just how devastating not getting back up to our assumed earnings rate would be for the plan, and decided we needed to do some things to protect the plan. And so we took a number of steps, and I'm not sure, Jean. Oh, here we go. Here's the slide. Yeah, go ahead.
You want to go?
Yeah, go to this. Go to that next slide for a second.
I was just going to amplify what you just said in this chart.
Okay.
Those green bars is what Sandy was afraid of. Those are the employer contribution rates, and that reddish line, that's what was projected under the assumed rate of return. And you see the green bars go through the roof, and that's the fear of not doing anything. I'll turn it back to you, Sandy. Later on, if we have time, we could show some live stress testing.
Oh, sure. That's great. So probably everybody can see what that fear was, and we knew we'd have to reduce benefits, we'd have to freeze COLAs or eliminate them, or employers would drop the plan. And none of those were good. It would create kind of a last man standing situation and possible or even probable demise of the plan. So what we did, we created a new framework that makes the plan sustainable into the future. And the value that I received from stress testing, and why I'm such a strong proponent of it, is that it focused our thinking on what we need to do in this particular case. And we realized we needed to change the way risk is shared, because risk was shared in the traditional way at the time. Either you raised employees' fixed rates, you cut or froze COLAs, you cut benefits, and you raised contribution rates. And all of the way that risk was shared had a negative outcome for just about everyone. And once we were done with that, we had done this once. Once we were done with that, we'd climb back up, and then maybe another 8 or 10 years passes and you have another negative market event. So we said there's got to be a better way. And what we did, we took all of the risks and we redistributed them. We had employers and employees share both have variable contribution rates. And we divided up the proportion into 55% employer, 45% employee. And then importantly, we created rate caps and minimums for both groups. And what this does is, in bad times, the rates can go up to the cap, but everybody knows they'll stop. And in good times, you get two benefits. The rates only go down to what the actual required contribution would be, or the normal cost. But employees get to share in the good times now as well as the bad. So during the lead up to this, employers got all of the benefit of the good times, And when the bad times came, employees lost some of their benefits, retirees lost some of their COLA, and and employers were mad that their rates were going back up. So we created that. And then that left us with the question of, well, what do you do if you have a big negative market event and the rates go above the combination of those caps? And this was an innovative arm of this particular model. What we do with those excess rates, and we'll show you that in a live modeling in a second, but we smooth those. We start treating that excess just the same way we treat it for employer and employee rates. We smooth those losses into the future COLAs or COLA eligibility, and so the entire excess doesn't have to be paid up front, but it gets smoothed into the COLAs for the future. And we did this for a specific reason, is that most of the time when you have a negative market event, you have a rebound. And we decided that rebounds always occur. And if they don't, there's pretty much a catastrophe going on economically anyway, and pensions aren't going to be at the top of anyone's list. So we decided to take that as an article of faith. And then when the markets rebound, we smooth those gains right back into the COLA eligibility. And when they gain enough, we start reducing the employer and employee rates below the cap. So what we did, we created a self-regulating mechanism and self-sustaining mechanism where no one is the majority loser and no one is the majority winner. Everybody shares in the risk equitably. So it's the same risk, a different distribution of that risk. And we came out with what we think is a much better model. Took it on the road with our employees for weeks and our employers, and they tended to concur with us. They understood the risks. We were able to explain it to them, and they were able to accept these changes that we made. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how, and we would do general stress testing for this plan and then targeted stress testing. And so Jean can run you through some of the ways that this plan works in terms of rates and the COLA.
Okay. So the screen you're looking at now, as contrasting with the screen you saw earlier, where before making some plan changes and the risk sharing that Sandy described, I want you to focus on the green bars. Those are the employer contributions. And again, the red line is what was expected. So after the changes in the risk sharing concept, it turned into this. The very same scenario, we're stress testing a period that mirrors the markets of 1968 to over the next 20, 25 years, which is up and down markets. And the employer contribution rates you see in the out years, the green bars, are capped, as are the member rates, because we have caps in here. Maximum of 21.5% in total. So when the actual evaluation is done and the caps are exceeded, you see on the left-hand side, those are the returns that are being modeled in the gray bars, but next to that, to the right of that, shaded red, that's the reduction in the COLA that would have been paid that year. So for example, if we had a 2.5% COLA and the red number was minus 50%, you'd only get 1.25% COLA for that year. So for all the years that you don't see any red shading, the full COLA that's allowed under the plan provisions is paid, but only in those red years where the cap was breached do we dip into the COLA. So I'm going to just flip momentarily to the live model, which produced those
Jean,
charts.
Can I add one thing there on that chart is those are the projected COLA reductions, but if the markets go back up, those change every year the markets go back up. So that's what the picture would look like in 2018 based on the prior rates. But if markets perform, I guess I see you've got how they actually would be performing. I'm sorry, my mistake.
Well, that's right, but your point is right. If this scenario happens, those are the COLAs, but if better returns happen, and that's where I was going with the live model. So now we're looking at, before anything ever started, this was the projection, and Sandy was worried about what if we have, let's see, where's my cursor? Some bad returns in here. Well, not that bad. And again, this is an example of stress testing where you can play with different returns, and we see the returns go, the employer contributions go well above where they expected. But if we put in the changes that they implemented, now under this scenario with two bad returns, we've got significant COLA reductions. But what I'm going to do in this stress testing is pick a period in history, 1928, which brings in some of the really bad Great Depression years. And what we did, we literally went through all periods of history to see how the plan does. So I told you to focus on the green bars, that those are the employer contributions, and the red line is what was expected. You can, and this is the COLA, these red areas, the COLA that's being reduced for that year. But there's the funded ratio of the plan. And if we go through time, and I'm literally now going through every economic period in history, and we have a plan that almost through all the periods in history remain well-funded. And this is a live stress testing experiment. And it shows how with this cost-sharing arrangement, the caps are never breached. The member's basic benefit, the multiplier times the final average salary, is always protected. But there is some risk sharing in the COLA. And for many years and generations, there is no COLA that's lost. So I don't know, Sandy, if you wanted to do any other type of stress testing, or you want to maybe talk about how this worked on the state side.
Yeah, no, we can talk about that. So I hope it's clear here that we took some of the worst periods to see what would happen. In the more typical times, when you put stuff in, the COLAs that's the COLA eligibility that is reduced. But if you've got low CPIs, they may be seeing a similar increase to what they would be already seeing. Okay, so I want to just say that was very targeted stress testing, so we could get a sense of what would happen and compare our model to what could happen to make sure everybody's benefit would be protected throughout their retirement. We also do very generalized stress testing in both plans, but in this case, it's our state and teacher plan. This is a very remarkable story, and Cheiron's been doing stress testing for this plan since forever. In the 1980s, at one point, this plan was 22% funded. And so it was, if not the worst, one of the 3 worst funded plans in the country. And
Sandy, that was at a 10% discount rate.
Yes, and at a 10% discount rate, 22% funded at a 10% discount rate. So the state of Maine commissioned studies, and out of that grew recommendations. And at that time, there was a commitment made to fund this plan from years of underfunding or other events. And the state started putting in approximately 20% per year of payroll, and they continued that. And you can see in the chart where we have records back to, because there was a fire and all of our records were lost at one point. But in 91, The plan had become 36% funded and was steadily increasing. And you can see it continue to increase. And through the 1990s, in 1995, there was a constitutional amendment passed, very strong constitutional amendment, which requires contributions and in essence prohibits new benefits from being awarded, in that you have to fund 100% of the new benefit in the year that you award it. So through the 90s, virtually no new benefits occurred. And so the funding continued to grow from that very low 22% up until 74, 75%, right around when the recession hit. And then we had to deal with the recession, but continued on. And you can also see down below that the contributions remained very stable, which at least in Maine is critical for budgeting and the success of the state continuing to put in MainePERS contribution. And so what they do here is that's the first thing they budget for is the pension contribution, and then the rest of the budget is built. So being able to share these projections with stakeholders, legislators, newspapers, everyone is really helpful. And we also found it enormously helpful. I just want to go back and say enormously helpful with our city and local government constituents and stakeholders in being able to show them just what can happen with the stress testing.
And Sandy,
is that your last slide or?
Yeah, it's the last slide, but I was thinking another important point we could touch is that about the importance or the benefits of having the stress testing done by the system as opposed to it being mandated on the system by legislature?
Yeah. So this is my personal strong-held position because I find stress testing so valuable. In we've lowered our discount rate in the last 10 years from 7 3/4 to 6 3/4, and made various other changes as we get to intimately know our risks in the plan. And so stress testing to me is a way to be on the offensive for the benefit of your members and your employers, and not on the defensive. And I think when someone else is doing the stress testing or mandating the terms of it, you don't have as much ownership. So I'm just a key proponent of owning and understanding your risks, and stress testing is a fantastic tool to do that, so that you're on the offensive for how to protect your plan versus being on the defensive.
Sandy, you made an interesting comment there about being on the offensive. I've noticed some funds, and Maine's one of them. Sometimes you go into the room with the stress testing models, and then the board takes over, and the actuary just sits to the side while the board plays the what-if games. And
yes, they do, and everyone can become very familiar. So I'm not sure if everyone on the phone will find out shortly when there's questions, but if everyone on the call already does stress testing. But if you don't, I would just say strongly it's something to embrace, and it's a great tool and nothing to be afraid of.
Sandy, thank you so much. So we have a number of questions. Let me ask the first question, which is it more important to stress test a poorly funded plan or a well-funded plan, or does it matter?
Oh, can I answer that, Gene?
Yes, we can probably both answer it, so you go first.
Yeah, I would say it's equally important. Our state teacher plan is on a definite path to be fully funded in the next decade, and recognize, because we will have the big debt from the 22% paid off in a decade. And So without that debt, we're already 100% funded. I think it's terribly important to stress test a fully funded plan because market events can hit a fully funded plan so hard. So either one, I think you have to address them differently, but you need to know the vulnerabilities that you're in both situations.
I was going to say the same thing, Sandy, so I have nothing to add.
I'm getting a couple of questions that are somewhat similar, so I'm going to try to sort of aggregate them. In terms of stress testing, what's the frequency? How often should they be done?
Well, if you build the tool, it's in place there, and it can be used at any meeting without any commissioning any additional studies or anything. So, for example, with Maine, if we come up to a meeting, we'll just load up the tool, and the board will work with it. There's no special study or report that's issued. It's just it's a learning session, and the board gets educated. And we for some clients, we actually put the tool online, and the board members will use the online version at their convenience. So,
Andy, at Maine. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Finish your thought, Gene.
That it's not really. It shouldn't be considered a special study. It should be considered a way of normal operating your fund.
Thank you, Gene.
And what I would,
Sandy.
yeah.
Yes, what I was going to ask you was at MainePERS, how often do you conduct the stress testing?
Well, we do. We definitely do it whenever we do an experience study, for sure. We'll use it in the interim, and especially over the last few years when we were thinking that we needed to lower our discount rate due to the low interest rate environment that we were in. So when we see an indicator, we'll bring it in and start looking at the stress testing tool to see if we're understanding the impacts correctly. So I'm going to agree with Jean. I think you need to do a fully robust one periodically where you just see everything. But I also think it works really well as a targeted learning tool when you see certain circumstances going on.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Rather than running one subjective stress testing scenario, wouldn't calculating and disclosing the investment risk defeasance measure convey similar or more objective information about risk?
I would totally disagree with that. Coming up with a low discount rate to measure a liability gives you no indication of stress testing. It's just a measurement. It's a measurement of how much risk you may be taking on the investment side, but you're not playing any type of what-if games. I think the stress testing tool that we're showing here is far more robust than just a simple line item. I know the New York City Employees Retirement System has disclosed that number every year in their valuation, and they still focus on this year versus last year's results.
Sandy, did you have an opinion, or should I go to the next one?
No, I do. I don't think that it is a substitute. I'll just give my personal opinion. I think that administering a pension plan successfully has a lot of subjectivity. Right now, we're in the aftermath of bad market events. For a while, we were in the glow of good market events, and I think in either one, you can get a distorted view of what's going on, and so you can overreact. And those are the things that concern me about like sort of a single data point. I think you have to look at the scenarios that could potentially happen and how people will react. You need to be mindful of, budget impacts, and you need to be mindful that if you take an extreme position when circumstances change, you're going to be out in an extreme position, not in one that can sort of go with the flow. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. But sometimes I think we tend to look at where we are at the moment instead of where we are over a continuum. And I think our actions are a blend of that continuum and shouldn't be based on anything so temporal as where we are at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, how involved are systems investment consultants in preparing stress testing for the valuation reports, or do the actuaries do the stress testing independently?
We like to work with the investment consultant to get their capital market expectations, and in Maine, their CIO, internal CIO, we work closely with whenever we do stress testing. So there ought to be a connection because the actuaries don't have the, we talked about stochastic analysis that requires an expected return and standard deviation of the portfolio. And so we like to work closely and integrate our efforts with the investment consultant.
Sandy, if you don't want to...
I'm in full agreement. I think it has to be a combination of all of the elements. I think it has to be a combination of administration, of investments, and the actuarial outcomes, because these are things that people have opinions and they're not necessarily based on good information. And what you need to do is have good information to help people, your stakeholders or board or whoever it is, have good informed decisions. So I do think it's a combination of all three.
Another question is, how many elements of a plan's fiscal health can be stress tested at one time?
Let me read that again.
How many elements of the plan's fiscal health can be stress tested at one time? I think what the question... Go ahead, Gene.
No, let me hear you out, because I'm not sure I understand what a physical element is.
So I'm reading the question, but my hunch is, I think, when you did the stress testing, I think one of the things that you focused in on was the COLA, right? And I guess... and if I'm correct about that, the question was asking, how many different variables, can you stress test, in the stress testing?
Well, okay, and I'm also wondering, Gene, before you answer, yeah. I'm wondering if maybe the question doesn't come from, can you do investment income and mortality and those kinds of things all at one time?
I think that's about right.
Okay, so let me try to answer by looking at the stress testing tool that I have up on the screen. Here, this morning or this afternoon, we spent most of our time stress testing let me get back to full mode. Most of the time we spent stress testing the investment return on the left-hand side, but there are other things up here, like we could have stress tested the cost-sharing arrangement between the employer and the employer. We could have stress tested different contribution caps, or different benefit levels, early retirement reduction factors. And there's, to the far right, I look at it as several other variables, and Sandy's right, we could also put in mortality. So pretty much everything under the sink you could stress test. It depends on what the most important issues are for a particular pension plan. And once you determine those, you build the tool to stress test those most important elements or variables for that plan.
So, Gene, if you have the live model up, put in the no for reduced COLA, because that was one of the things that we looked at. Are you able to do that over at the right?
Wasn't that that was this one where we that was where we saw that if you don't reduce the COLA, that's when you saw the employer contributions go through the roof,
okay.
Right?
That wasn't an input, that was an output. Okay.
Yep. Actually, it might be, but I don't recall which run that was.
Okay.
Maybe it was one of the runs that we ran, but
But I think the point is the way that this particular model was built, we took the risk variables that were most important to us, such as the split of the cost sharing and the caps. We played around with different caps and ran market investment scenarios based on the year. So we would play around with different variables that are up here, and we could see what the outcomes were. So if we raised the cap to 25%, obviously the COLA reduction becomes less. So we found we needed to balance.
And Sandy, I think I just found what you were asking for. It says here, where the cursor is, reduce COLA, yes. And you said, what if we didn't reduce the COLA? Mm-hmm. And it showed different results. So we could build that in, and there was, whether it was for everyone or just new hires or the early retirement factors. We could have even put in the multiplier if we wanted to, but the strong intent here was to protect fully the basic benefit.
So I have a couple of questions relative to COLAs. One is, were there auto triggers other than contribution rates and COLAs?
There were some early retirement reduction factors to make them actuarial equivalents, and some provisions relating to 30 and out, I guess, Sandy? So there was some of that besides the contributions.
Hank, are you asking about what else we did in this plan to make this model work?
I'm not entirely sure. Again, I'll read the question. Were there were there auto triggers other than contribution rates and COLAs?
Well, yeah. We balanced what we considered the key triggers that had to be balanced. Was the main one. We wanted to assure that we could pay the core benefit, the multiplier times the number of years times the final average salary, throughout every single member's lifetime without losing sleep, that something could happen to that. So we focused on that core benefit. And then we started looking at the risks that could impact that, which was rates go too high. So we looked at rate caps and other benefits that may take away our ability to do that. So I guess you could. There were other triggers. Trying to think of all
Sandy,
the ones
if I
that
could
we considered.
add to that, one of the triggers that was considered but rejected was changing the multiplier, right? You wanted to protect that basic benefit.
Yeah, I'm thinking the question is saying what kind of were the risks you were trying to moderate by triggers? What else was causing problems for the plan? And I think it was really primarily rates going too high and then employers dropping out of the plan was what really triggered this model.
Yeah, and that, you mentioned the last man's club, Sandy, but that was one of the most critical factors that led to this modification. Had nothing been done, employers had the ability to simply leave the plan and not pay anything. And that would have left the unfunded liability to a smaller and smaller group of employers until you just had a few, and we were convinced that there was a risk of plan implosion.
Yeah.
So we're getting fairly close to the end, and I still have 3 questions. So let me ask them quickly. The first of the last 3 is, the largest COLA reduction shown is 97%. Is a 100% reduction not allowed? What happens if COLAs are reduced to 0? Employer caps are reached and returns still fall short. Could you run a scenario with 4% return for 20 years? That's a lot of questions in one, but that's one of the 3.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me do the last one real quick. That's the easiest one. So there's 4% each and every year, and that would pretty much get rid of the COLA for many years. I think 97 is probably a good proxy for 100, Cindy. There was really no limit on that But I
No,
think just
there was no limit.
the way this model's working out, you could almost pretty much construe 97% as 100. So 4%
Yeah,
each and every year.
I just want to add very quickly to the person who wrote the question is that we talked at great length about those kinds of things with our members and our retirees, and we all recognize that if these scenarios happen, we all have bigger economic problems to deal with. And so that's why they were good with the model that we built, because they understand that's unlikely to happen, but they also understand that given bad circumstances, their plan will be protected.
Great. I think this is the last question. The other question was withdrawn, but the last question is it's not precisely on stress testing, but relative to the risk sharing plan that MainePERS has. Sandy, for those who are interested in learning more about how you guys came to the risk sharing model, sort of the pros and cons of that, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
My email is my name, sandy.matheson, MATHESON, @mainepers.com. And my telephone number is 207-512-3190. And more than happy to share information about that.
Great. Sandy, Jean, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. For those who are on the webinar, at the conclusion of this webinar, there are 3 short survey questions that we ask you to answer. Thank you so much for participating in the last webinar for 2018, and we look forward to hosting you on additional webinars in 2019. Jane, Sandy, thank you so much. Happy holidays, everyone.
Same to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.